Hello and welcome to this LinkedIn Live. We're broadcasting to you today from the Farnborough Air Show. I'm John Coykendall and I lead the U.S. Industrials and Aerospace practice for Deloitte. I'm thrilled to host today's discussion as we delve into a fascinating topic of building resilient supply chains within aerospace and defense. I'm joined here today by two of my aerospace and defense colleagues and for this discussion, and I'm going to turn to them and let them introduce themselves. Julia?
Hi, I'm Julia Arkell and I'm the UK Aerospace and Defence lead here at Deloitte.
Hi, I'm Jean-Louis Rassineux, based out of Paris, and I'm leading globally our industrial products and aerospace sector.
So let's set the scene for the conversation we're going to have today. As we all know, it's been a turbulent 4 years for the aerospace and defense industry. Of course, we had COVID-19, which we all remember, and thankfully in the past. But we've also seen a number of natural disasters, lots of geopolitical upheaval, and all of that together has really pushed supply chain to the top of the list of challenges that our aerospace and defense clients are talking about. It's contributed to significant delivery delays in the products, both on the defense side and the commercial side. I think the good news is we're starting to see improvements in supply chain. And what we'd really like to focus on in our discussion today is what are some of the changes that are happening and strategies that we're seeing aerospace and defense companies implement to drive resilience in their supply chains. So Julie, I'm going to turn to you first. How do you see, how do the current supply chain challenges compare to what we saw when we were in the depths of the pandemic?
Thanks, John. I think broadly speaking, things have improved, but I think we probably would have expected more improvement since the pandemic. But actually, as you mentioned, due to kind of geopolitical challenges and external factors, and also that drive to produce more aircraft, to ramp up through the industry, is putting a lot of pressure on the supply chain, and it's in the headline of the news just this week while we're here. And so, our clients are overwhelmingly telling us they need more resilient supply chains, and they need to de-risk those. And actually, they need to, and to do that, they also need to decarbonize those supply chains. So, as you said, we'll be talking a little bit more about some of those strategies as we go today.
Awesome. And Jean-Louis, after this intense kind of period of focus on resiliency for many of our clients, do you see a pivot or a shift to a greater focus on profitability? Because there's always this balance between profitability, resilience. What are you seeing?
Thanks, John, for this question. And indeed, it has to be a balance between the level of resiliency, how much agile your supply chain is going to become, versus how do you maintain, how do you improve profitability? In this industry, profitability has always been a key concern, and the way to improve it at the same time of the resiliency must be considered. And that comes into several factors. We are talking from the workforce cost, down to all the supply chain costs, starting with logistics, supply chain, supplier costs. So all of these factors needs to be optimized at the same time as we optimize the resiliency and the agility of the global supply chain to get the complete picture and the holistic view.
I think maybe building on your points, we are increasingly seeing companies restructuring supply chain as they look to find this balance between resiliency, efficiency, cost effectiveness. If I look at the North American markets, as you both know, I'm from the U.S. market. One of the trends we're seeing is kind of this push towards nearshoring. So companies, maybe U.S.-based companies, bringing manufacturing and supply chain back, maybe onshore in the U.S., maybe nearshore, Canada and Mexico. We're seeing some similar trends in some of the Asian countries with similar kind of behavior, India, Thailand, Malaysia, an example. And when we look at what's kind of behind this shift, it's not surprisingly a lot of the factors we've been talking about, but desire to reduce logistics costs, reduce logistics time, it's trying to avoid geopolitical risk. Even increasingly, we're with some of the discussions around more tariffs. Right? We're seeing that across many industries, not just aerospace and defense, but that's also driving decisions about where to relocate supply chains. And it's ultimately about reducing lead times and hopefully at the same point really driving reduction in cost associated with that. One thing I think is always important to acknowledge, particularly on the defense side, is there are limitations in terms of what can be done just due to government regulation. Sometimes certain intellectual property has to be in certain geographies, certain countries you're allowed to trade with. So that of course has to be considered as part of this. So Jean-Louis, I'm asking you turn to you with another question. What are some of the primary drivers you're seeing for restructuring supply chains?
Yeah, as we mentioned, one of the primary driver has definitely in this context to be the agility and the ability to restructure the supply chain in an agile way to respond to constraints that we don't know that may happen and that we have seen in the past with COVID or with the geopolitical conflicts that happen all over the world. That's really definitely number one. The second one is also, as we mentioned, about the cost. How do we optimize the global cost? So you mentioned labor, how do we go near shore? And that's a tendency we observe also in Europe, is reindustrialization of Europe versus the tendency of the last maybe 20 to 30 years. So that's a major tendency. There's also another factor in the supply chain we need to consider over Europe, which might be a bit different from the States, is the equilibrium that needs to be defined between the different European countries. We cannot just adhere to one. We need to be sure that there is a proper work sharing between the participating countries. So all these drivers need to be taken into account, geopolitical repartition, sharing between the countries, costs, agility, and all these drivers, we need to find the proper optimum, which might not be an easy one.
So Julia, let's turn to a specific topic that's always very important to aerospace and defense, which is critical minerals. And we're talking minerals like lithium, nickel, cobalt. And as we know, these are vital to advanced manufacturing. They're vital components in many aerospace and defense products. And when you look at the supply chains for these critical minerals, they're complex. It tends to be, in many cases, only one or two sources. And in some cases, it feels almost like a monopoly of the supply chain. And yet these are critical parts that every aerospace defense company is looking for. So can you speak a bit to some of the challenges and what companies are doing to try to get around those challenges?
Sure. So yeah, critical by name and kind of critical by nature. Not only are they have really specialist performance kind of properties. So things that you just can't easily replace in a component, but also as you say, really really vital for the A&D industry particularly, but increasingly for other industries as well. So the competition for these critical minerals is only increasing. So when you add that together with, as you say, these sort of supply chains that are complicated, often opaque, and in many cases very kind of monopolized in certain places where there can be certain ESG concerns as well, that really does make it challenging. And for example, I think there are sort of 13 critical minerals that we define as sort of strategically important for A&D, and one nation can be responsible for between 50 and 70% of the entire output. So as an A&D company, that's a real challenge to manage, on top of other, as we're talking about, other kind of supply chain concerns.
Very interesting. Well, something we know our clients will continue to put a lot of focus on.
Yeah.
So let's shift to the role that industrial policy can play in really driving manufacturing. And since we all represent sort of different geographies, we'll put a little bit of a geographic lens on it. So maybe Julia, if I'll turn to you first, bring a UK perspective on how are industrial policies driving profitable growth in manufacturing in the UK?
I guess, it's a well-quoted statistic, isn't it, that half the world's population, will have the opportunity at least to go, to the polls this year. And as we'd have seen, we had the new UK Prime Minister here at Farnborough on Monday, less than sort of 3 weeks into role, and any kind of change in government and change in policy has the the potential to make significant impacts, and whether that's around kind of incentivization or grants or regulation, or actually the wider policy. So I think that resonated with his announcement was around like the skills that are needed for like the aerospace defence, like the workforce. How do we create the new skills for the future, the new team that's going to take A&D forward? And if you think about it from the UK perspective, to keep us right at the cutting edge of the industry, and that feeds right into the supply chain from the biggest OEMs right down into the smallest SMEs.
Interesting. Jean-Louis, how about broader European perspective?
Yeah, I think one important factor, what we have seen in the last years, today we have the opportunity with technology, and I think technology will be also a key driver in reshaping the supply chain, in the sense that we can use our workers onshore, nearshore, to do the tasks that were not possible in the past at low cost, but increasing the level of automation by implementing GenAI, digital operations, smart factory. That will enable us to reconsider the way we source, and then we can benefit also from the governmental policies that are in place.
And so I'll build on your comments about some sort of European and UK with just a bit of a US perspective. In the last few years, we've seen really significant policy decisions in the US and investments from the government to drive manufacturing. And I truly believe we're at the beginning of a renaissance in manufacturing in the US. We've had major US acts like the IRA and the CHIPS Act, which have just put enormous amounts of funding. Interesting statistic is from 2021 to 2023, we saw a 2.5x increase in private sector investment in manufacturing. So it shows that as a result of the government's actions, putting a focus on manufacturing, there's a lot of money going into it. Our defense industrial base, kind of national policy, is also setting clear objectives around critical minerals and other capabilities that are important to the U.S. government to have, ensure access to certain ones. One of the other dimensions is also free trade agreements. So the U.S. has free trade agreements with 20 other countries. One of the most important is the USMCA, which is with the U.S., Mexico, Canada. That is up for renewal in a couple years, so that'll be something we'll watch back to the elections and administration. We'll watch to see that. And then I think the other piece is that we've talked about a little bit is just the impact of tariffs. And that's another form of industrial policy that a country can take, and that will have certain impacts. So, all right, let's shift and talk a bit about kind of strategies that companies are using to reduce dependency they might have on any one country, because I think that's sort of the theme here, right? Part of resiliency is you don't want single points of failure. And so, Julie, I'll start with you, and just what are you seeing in terms of broad strategies companies are implementing so that to ensure they're not dependent on one supplier, one country, one region for something?
Yeah. I think we're seeing companies take a more forensic look at their supply base. And not just perhaps like the financials of those suppliers, also their ability to deliver, but also taking into account their credentials around kind of ESG and kind of their ability to decarbonize. And that is in order to positively, as well as part of the kind of the solution for the supply chain disruption, means that they are now going to a more kind of dual sourcing or +1 or +2 kind of supplier approach. And certainly, for example, I think it's sort of quoted that sort of like 57% of industrial manufacturers with operations in China are certainly looking at that kind of supplier +1 strategy. And so that kind of takes into account trying to do that risk mitigation, but also that increases the number of suppliers that you have to manage. So putting in place, the tools and things that you need in order to do that is actually really important.
Jean-Louis, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think in addition to what you mentioned, Julia, what we see is keeping the base of existing supplier, the legacy suppliers, as a safety, and at the same time ramping in other countries a new base of supplier. so that you have this dual possibility, because we know that things are not so easy to ramp up. So there is this duality between the old base, the new base, and the duality that you were mentioning. I think that's also the important point.
Maybe I'll build on that with a related question around what are some of the strategies you're seeing companies implement to expand sort of their own capacities? And maybe Jean-Louis, I'll start with you.
Yeah. One of the expansion of the capacity is obviously through merger and acquisitions that may be observed. So you have horizontal integration that might lead to a wider base of suppliers and also access to better conditions, obviously due to the size. We also see a lot in this industry of vertical integration by reshaping the supply chain. And at the same time, within this vertical integration, it's working together with the suppliers to foster innovation, make sure they are confident about the ramp up that they must do in terms of investment, so that you build your full supply chain together with your suppliers to avoid any risk of failure that might happen as a new restructuring.
And Julia, how about you? What would you add?
Yeah, I think it's how do you get that supply chain to work in sync, sort of operating all together. And so I think, we are seeing kind of clients look to bring in some of their own capabilities, so bringing new manufacturing kind of sites in-house, or whether actually investing in equipment or software that actually enables that sharing of information throughout the supply chain to enable it to move more in sync. And I'm going to come back to my favourite topic of critical minerals, because it's just it's so critical and actually so interesting as an example in this. So, we're discussing things like how do you make more consistent supplier requests so that you're getting the same information from those suppliers to understand, and particularly kind of reduce the burden on SMEs. Who may be only a small, but here's the word again, critical part of your supply chain. And then the other area is like developing circularity. So how can you reuse and recover the materials within those components so reducing the risk in terms of the volume that you need to move through the supply chains. And we've seen that done quite well with Renim in aircraft engines. So there's definitely, I think, more ability to do that. And then I think to come back to the kind of, we talk about dual sourcing, but then there's also, actually, what about alternative sourcing? So could you use a different material, not compromising quality or performance, but actually is there an alternative you could really consider?
So I want to build on, you both mentioned in your answers a bit about technology, and I think no conversation would be complete without acknowledging the role technology plays. I mean, you can't run a supply chain without a strong technology backbone. I think we're seeing clients making a lot of investments in emerging technologies. You mentioned some examples of kind of supply chain resiliency, risk. Smart factory, I think you mentioned, Jean-Louis, as another way to get more visibility. It was interesting yesterday riding on the train to Farnborough, and you never know who you're going to sit next to, when I found myself sitting next to the CEO of a startup that basically has developed a supply chain visibility solution that allows a company at whatever tier to get visibility down, which is, it's a bit of the holy grail, right? If you can really see what's happening down in the supply chain, there's no better way to drive risk reduction. So just curious, Julia, I'll start with you. Anything else you would add in terms of what you're seeing companies doing as it relates to digital technologies to improve supply chain resilience?
Yeah, I think it's that point about illumination, kind of how can you see down through the supply chain, and also and that comes back to how do you do that data sharing? How can you do that in like a collaborative way? So that's certainly where we're seeing companies kind of adopt digital to make that a lot easier.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Building on what you said, digital thread is becoming a reality. Data are shared between suppliers from the early stage, from the engineering stage down to production stage. And one major area where AI can play a role is definitely in optimizing inventory, as you mentioned also, John, planning in advance for the supply chain and being extremely reactive. So all this complex algorithm with the help of AI might see a lot of improvements and help, reshape the supply chain in a more agile, efficient, cost-efficient way.
And maybe just to add to your two comments, it's not only the visibility, whether it's in the supply chain, or I think of smart factory solutions that bring visibility real time to what's happening on the floor, but it's then the translation of that visibility into what do you do?
Yeah.
In the moment, what is the decision that should be made in terms of what thing to work on the factory floor, what thing you can't work on because maybe you don't have the right labor, you don't have the right materials to do that. And that's I think where we're seeing a lot of our clients get a lot of value out of these kinds of solutions is in the real-time information that allows a shop floor supervisor to make the best decision of what to work next is absolutely critical. Well, with that, I would like to thank both my colleagues, thank our audience for listening to this very exciting topic and discussion on supply chain resiliency. We're excited to be heading out to the air show very shortly, and appreciate everybody listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.